must a man walk down before you call him a man? How many seas must the white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? How many times must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. How many years can a mountain exist before it's washed to the sea? How many years can some people exist before they're allowed to be free? How many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. How many times must a man look up before he really sees the sky? How many ears must one person have before he can hear people cry? How many deaths will it take till he knows that too many people have died? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
That one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
Check, check. Would you please join me in prayer? Dear Lord, we just thank you for this opportunity, this privilege to come together. We just thank you for Dr. Freeman to be here to help enlighten us and help us love and understand each other. We just pray that her words will give us some healing and she'll shed some light on this sometimes crazy world that we live in. We also pray that you'll see her safely home as well as the rest of us. And we just thank you all and thank you, God, for all that you do and all that you've given us. Amen. Y'all know this racial justice series we're having is in reaction to the killing of George Floyd and all the protests and things that have happened. So much has happened in our world, and so that's why we're having this racial justice series. I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Catherine Anderson Freeman. She's an assistant professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of Sociology at the University of Houston. She received a PhD from the University of Arizona in 2016. Professor Anderson specializes in sociology of health, illness, urban sociology, race, ethnicity, and organizations. Her work is generally focused on the understanding of social sources of health disparities in the United States. In particular, she examines the role of race, ethnicity, and urban neighborhood dynamics to analyze how these factors may affect individual health. Please give a warm Northwoods welcome to Dr. Catherine Anderson Freeman. Thank you, Dr. Freeman.
So thanks for having me here today. I'm Kate Anderson, and like you said, I'm a professor at the University of Houston in the sociology department. And I mainly look at health disparities by race in the United States, but I also regularly teach classes on racial and ethnic relations in the US at both the undergrad and grad levels. And this current semester, I'm teaching a graduate seminar on race, ethnicity, with the sociology students in our graduate program. So this has been an interesting year to teach on this topic, and I think it's great that you guys want to engage more on this topic. I think it's really important that people want to have this conversation, even though this conversation is clearly an uncomfortable one, right? Talking about race in the United States, talking about racism in the United States is not an easy topic to grapple with. And so I think it's wonderful that your faith community is trying to make sense of this, trying to understand it, trying to understand what you can do in order to grapple with this topic. So I'm going to talk, or try to talk, about an overview of the history of racism in the United States, which is a big topic. I don't think I will do anything but scratch the surface here today, but my hope is that maybe we can start a conversation, we can start grappling with some of these ideas, we can scratch the surface a little bit, even though there's really, we could talk for weeks about this topic. I mean, I do talk about weeks for this topic in my seminars at the university, and even then we probably don't even do anything but scratch the surface. So, before talking about a history of racism, I want to talk about what race is. And that might seem fairly obvious to you. You're like, hey, I'm a human that's been living in the United States. I know what race is. But I think it's important to make sense first of what race is before we can make sense of what racism is. Because without a working definition of race, it's hard to kind of go beyond that and talk about what racism is. And so before talking about what racism is, I want to talk about, or before even talking about what race is, I want to talk about what race is not. So race is not a biologic or genetic construct. So I know that oftentimes we talk about it in that way. We talk about race as though it's this sort of inherent quality of peoples. And I think the reason why we talk about it in this way is because we identify race by physical features. So we look at other people, we look at aspects of them, typically their skin color, or this is also referred to as phenotype, where we use elements of their physical features to make sense of what's going on with race. So I realize I'm not advancing my slides. I will do that. I don't see it going. Am I doing this right? There we go. Okay. So I have some. Okay, there we go. So thinking about what race is not, it is not biological. And it's because we oftentimes look at other people and that's how we determine their race. But what it is actually is a social construct. And by that, I don't mean that it's not real. It's just that these are products of human classification. And what I mean by that, or sort of evidence for that, is that how we define what racial groups we have in the United States has changed considerably over time. So who was considered in what group in 1900 versus 1800 versus now has changed. These are not fixed categories. And these groups are also different across the world. So if you were to go to another country, you would find different racial schemes for how people classify individuals. And so all this kind of points to the idea that these aren't inherent qualities, inherent genetic qualities of people, but rather that these are social constructions, things that we have decided upon as a society. And modern genomic science has backed this up. So now that we have mapped the human genome, we have found that there's just as much genetic variation between groups as there is within groups. So there's very little genomic basis for how we can think about these different racial groups. And that makes sense, right? If we think about the category of Asian that we have in the United States, this includes anyone from Asia, which if you think about China alone has over 1 billion people, India alone has over 1 billion people, those people look nothing like each other. And if we take the sum total of Asia, we're talking about over 4 million people. So the idea that 4 million people would have some sort of genetic commonality is probably fairly far-fetched, right? So race is not a genetic or biologic construct. And this is important because it's not innate, right? We've made these things up as a society. So instead, we can more readily think about race as being a social construction. And by that, I don't mean that race is not real. So sometimes when I use this word that it's a social construction, people mean to say that, or they think that what I'm saying is that race is fake, that it's made up, it's not real. And it is real, because it's real in its consequences. It's meaningful. It is real in our society by the way that we have defined it. And so all I mean to say by race as a social construction is that it is a product of human perception and classification, that we as a society have decided upon these categories. And this is meaningful because of how we think about kind of how this translates to racism. So if we, oops, wrong way here. Sorry, this clicker is not agreeing with me. Nope, okay. Okay, it's not going, it's going the opposite way of where I think I'm going. Okay. There we go. Okay, now it's working. Okay, so why this matters, why thinking about race as a social construction, is that in this definition, we can think about race as primarily boundary work, right? That we're drawing distinctions between us and them, and we're doing this for the purpose of, there's some meaning behind that, right? That racism and race and this definition of race is really about power, right? If you're trying to mark a distinction between me versus you, us versus them, these groups are meaningful in this manner, then it matters for making sense of the power structure that then results and what we get in terms of racism. Okay. It's not always going in the direct, like, you hit the same button and it goes in both ways. That's the part. Okay. Yes. Okay. All right. Clicker's not working. I was clicking the same button and sometimes it was going forward and sometimes it was going back. All right. Yeah. Technology doesn't always work like how you want it to. All right. So why this is meaningful of boundary work and marking this distinction between us versus them is because how it relates to racism. If we're using this definition, if we're thinking about race in its definition as being primarily about boundary making, us versus them, then this makes sense for racism. So racism, in its most bare bone definitions, and this is like a dictionary definition, is a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. So the idea of racism in its bare bones definition is that it is a classification system that uses race as the basis by which we determine who is superior and who is inferior. So what this then looks like is we can have various manifestations of this, but and this is how we oftentimes talk about this as a society, right? So we talk about prejudice, we talk about stereotypes, we talk about racial discrimination, and these are more so the manifestations of racism rather than the definitions of racism. So prejudice we can think of as being sort of holding prejudicial ideas about other groups. Stereotypes is generalizing about other groups, whether that be their attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and so on and so forth. We can think about racial discrimination, and this is probably the most salient manifestation of racism, is where there's kind of active discriminatory processes, usually meaning that some opportunity is being denied to a person, right, on the basis of race. But all of these things are the various ways that we can see racism play out. But racism is inherently about a system of power and one that privileges a certain group over another group. And in our society, the group that is privileged, the group that is held in higher esteem, the group that kind of in our hierarchy are whites. So we have a system in our society of white supremacy in particular. All right, so how can we make sense then of racism over time? And this is hard to do, right? So we have a long history of racism. So what I'm going to do is try to first talk about these and paint in really broad strokes, right? So kind of overgeneralize a little bit here, and then slow down and give more details when talking about racism now. So trying to make sense of racism in the 21st century. So I'll go really zoomed out, and obviously I'm going to miss a lot of details. I'm not going to spend time on the details of specific, specific measures in Jim Crow and things like that. I'm not going to go through all of those kinds of details, because that, we'll be here for weeks if we do that. So we won't do that. We'll paint in some broad strokes, but know that I am overgeneralizing. All right, so racism really got its modern start through European colonization. And this is not to say that no one had prejudicial ideas about other groups or had, contact or conflict with other groups. But European colonization in particular was important for a few reasons. So it created unprecedented contact between people groups. So like no other time before were people interacting with all kinds of other people. And that interaction was specifically for the purpose of economic gain. So European colonizers weren't just out there checking out the lay of the land, they were there for a purpose, and that purpose was to line the coffers of their imperial sending nations, which matters because the European imperial economy required labor as cheaply as possible. So our sort of modern obsession with race really started out as creating a social system that justified the elimination or exploitation of other people, right? That's really where our kind of current modern understanding of race got its start. But this has taken on a few different flavors over time. So first, we have a period in which religion is the kind of dominant organizing principle around race. So, and really kind of the justification for race and racism was really centered around religious definitions. So, and part of this was that contact between other peoples really challenged a lot of Christian ideas, for better or for worse, right? But it did present a challenge. There's all these other people groups out there doing different things, did present a challenge in many ways. So what we find is that early thought on race and racism, consequently, was that the justification of the elimination and exploitation of other people really centered around the idea that these other groups of people were not fully human, right? They did not have souls that were worth saving. We see that, in early slavery, these people groups did not even, they didn't even attempt to convert them because the idea was that they're not convertible because they don't have souls in the same way that these European people did. And so it at the time was a very powerful justification for why it was okay to either eliminate or exploit these other people groups. And part of this, too, is that in many cases there was a very tight coupling between the church and the state and the economy, right? So if we think about, especially a lot of the Catholic-sending nations, the church and the state were one and the same. And so kind of acting in the economic interests of the state, the church was often an arm of that. So early on, we see this largely religious justification for these racial projects that we see play out. Then we see this move into the realm of science, though. So science becomes a thing, right? So prior to this, we didn't, science wasn't much of a thing, but we get this, we move into this era in which Enlightenment principles really change how a lot of people think. Science becomes a much more dominant force in society. And so too, racial projects move into the realm of science. And science becomes the major justification for what's going on. So we see a lot of efforts on the part of scientists to classify racial groups on the basis of science, right? So to use these kind of biologic definitions of race, that's really, kind of points back to my earlier point about how we define race, is that in large part this, this comes from early pseudoscience, or what's referred to sometimes as scientific racism, where they, scientists were doing all sorts of interesting things like measuring the volume of skulls and things like that to try to prove that, it's not just that these people are different, but that they're different and inferior, right? So that we can kind of demonstrate using the principles of science that these people deserve to be treated this way because they are, in fact, biologically inferior. So we kind of have this era in which biology is the dominant way that we think about race and the way in which racism is justified. Then into the 20th century, we move into an era in which politics and government really becomes the dominant way to think about race. So we get political definitions of race, and by that I don't mean like Republican versus Democrat or things like that. What I mean is that the United States Census Bureau, it becomes the body that's largely responsible for categorizing groups of people. Oftentimes it was a legal process to be categorized as a certain group. And what we get is a lot of codification of racial injustices. So the Jim Crow Project was essentially a way to say, okay, we no longer have a system of slavery, but how can we systematically codify a way to make sure that certain groups can't vote with these stipulations. And so we really see racial projects move into the realm of the political, and we see political action being the primary way in which both groups are defined and they are also exploited, is through these kind of specific ways that we could categorize groups and justify where they live, what jobs they can have, those kinds of things, whether or not they can vote, things like that. But then we, in the middle to late 20th century, we get the civil rights movement, which undoes a lot of these legal forms of discrimination, and we get major changes in terms of how we think about race, the extent to which legalized racism is okay. We see a major shift in these sorts of things. And in the 1960s, a number of measures were passed which basically made all legal forms of overt discrimination illegal. So you can no longer legally discriminate in hiring, housing, any of these arenas on the basis of race. So problem solved, right, guys? We're done. It's illegal now. No. But a lot of people have asked this question of whether or not we are, in fact, living in a post-racial America. And the successes of the civil rights movement, we watched that video at the beginning, really did lead a lot of people to say that, hey, we moved past our race problem. We no longer have legal discrimination. Even when you ask people, on surveys and things like that, we've seen a major shift towards, more and more Americans, every survey that someone does, people are far less likely to express overtly racist attitudes. They're far more likely to embrace egalitarian attitudes about race. We see racial and ethnic minorities in this country making major gains in terms of income, education, politics even. We have now had both a black president and a black vice president, so we're done, right? The problem is solved. And all of these things are gains, and they are real, and a lot of these have been the direct result of these measures that were taken in the 1960s. We have made gains, so we don't want to discount that. But I don't think there are many people in the United States who would say that we are totally past our race problem, especially not if you ask racial and ethnic minorities. And surveys do show that there's a big gulf in between the way whites make sense of our race problem and the way minorities make sense of our race problem. Whites are far less likely to acknowledge that we have a race problem, or that it's a big problem, right? So yes, gains have been made, progress has been made. We have had a black president, which for many people was unthinkable. But that doesn't mean that we've solved the question of race. And I think that's become really obvious to a lot of people over the last year especially. So instead, what I'm going to do is spend the rest of the time talking about kind of a modern conceptualization of what racism looks like in the 21st century. So we can think about race in a few different, or racism in a few different ways. So we can think about it as an individual level phenomenon, largely played out in terms of racial prejudice or discrimination. So if you're deciding who to hire, if you are a racist, you may decide not to hire a racial and ethnic minority because you have stereotypical attitudes or prejudice about that person, right? So that's one way we can kind of think about racism. But what I really want to talk about for the rest of the time here is about institutionalized or structural racism. And I think this has come to a lot of people's attention over the last year. So rather than thinking about racism as an individual level problem, because I don't think most of us do have much of a problem in that sense, right? I don't think most of us in this room have ever used the N-word, or at least not have used it in a long time, right? But that doesn't mean that our society is past this just because no one's using the N-word anymore, right? I mean, obviously some people still are, but it's, most people wouldn't anymore, and it's highly socially unacceptable to do so. But that doesn't mean, just because we don't use racial epithets or see racism on a daily basis kind of play out in this way, it doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist. And so what I really want to put forward to you today is this idea that it's largely a structural problem, and that's really where a lot of, what happened with George Floyd was less of a problem of the individual officer and more of a problem with a structure in which we are embedded that enabled that to happen. So thinking about this, there's a sociologist, his name is Eduardo Bonilla Silva, and he wrote a book called Racism Without Racists, in case you're interested. And it's about this issue of, well, we no longer have these people who identify as, being these flagrant racists, but why do we still see these problems in our society? And so he argues that we shouldn't be thinking about this as an individual level problem. We should be thinking about this as a structural problem. And he argues for a new racism that largely plays out in this way. And he, in his book, provides a really nice definition of racism as a structure. And I'll read it for you here, because it's nice the way he words it. It's that racism is a structure, that is, as a network of social relations at social, political, economic, and ideological levels that shapes the life chances of various races. So the idea is that race and racism have permeated into many aspects of our society, such that it culminates in all of these different arenas: social, political, economic, ideological life, such that at the end of the day, the life chances of white people versus racial and ethnic minorities in this country are not the same, right? That even if individuals do all of the same things, their life chances are not the same. And that's the fundamental problem of race in our country, is that you can do the same things and your life chances are not the same, right? That as a white person, I will be conferred advantages that my black counterparts don't have. for no other reason than the color of my skin, right? That our life chances are fundamentally shaped by this problem. And so where he argues that this plays out is in a few different ways. So he argues that our problem of racism has moved from the overt into the covert, so that we no longer have these things out in the open. We don't use direct racial terminology. We don't talk about race directly or explicitly oftentimes. So when you hear politicians talking about our race problem, they use words like urban and suburban rather than white and black, right? So we see it play out in ways that where the speaker could deny the fact that they are speaking about race, but they are speaking about race. And that oftentimes, and this is the biggie, that where this plays out in terms of the life chances of individuals is that the mechanisms have become invisible, right? So it used to be that housing discrimination was extremely overt, that if you wanted to buy a house in a black neighborhood, you would A, be denied the FDA loan, and B, there might be a something explicitly written into the racial covenant, into the neighborhood covenant that said black people cannot buy a house here, right? Which is really obvious, right? Like the discrimination of that is very obvious. Whereas we are almost as segregated now as we were prior to 1968 in the Fair Housing Act, but it no longer happens by the sentence in the neighborhood covenant that says black people aren't allowed to buy houses here. Instead, we see it in much more subtle ways, in much more invisible ways that make it difficult for an individual to say, oh, I'm being discriminated against, right? So it may look more like the person calls up and they're told, oh no, I just sold that house, or no, I just let that apartment out, sorry, or that they're being steered into particular neighborhoods, or that there are algorithms that make a particular loan cost more for a black individual than it does for a white individual, making it prohibitively expensive to enter in a particular neighborhood, in the same way that the white person would not, because they got a better interest rate, right? So there's these mechanisms that then are less obvious to people, right? There's no longer the sentence that says black people can't move here, but there's other mechanisms that make sure that black people don't move there. And then even when they do, white people leave that neighborhood, so then it is no longer even the white neighborhood that they thought that they were buying into, or no longer an integrated space, right? So we get these other mechanisms that reproduce racial inequality that is no longer overt. It's moved into the covert. And it's that inability to kind of point to the specific mechanisms that makes it hard to undo, right? If there's no, if there's a sentence in a in a neighborhood covenant that says this, you can be like, well, take that out, right? But if it's all these subtle, invisible mechanisms, it's really hard to undo that. But these have the effect of shaping the life chances of people in this country on the basis of race, and fundamentally on the basis of race. All right, so he argues in the book, too, that there's a few different important arenas in which we see this play out. And I could spend a few weeks talking about this topic, too. So instead, I'm just going to blitz through this, and if you have more questions, we can talk about it in the Q&A. So he argues that there's a few key arenas where we see this, and that is social interactions, our political structure, social control, which is largely the criminal justice system, and in racial and economic inequality. So first, for social interaction, we are still an extremely segregated society. So we don't live in the same spaces, we don't go to the same schools, we have extremely low rates of interracial marriage. So we are not interacting in social space. And like in my example before about housing opportunities, all of this is happening through these invisible mechanisms, right? That we don't live in the same neighborhoods, so therefore we don't go to the same schools. But the schools are different. They are not equal, even though they are separate. And so we see a different opportunity structure that occurs from that place of interaction. And then when we aren't interacting in social spaces, that also affects how we see other people, right? So we see this have ramifications that spill over into a bunch of different facets of life, such that those life chances become fundamentally shaped by these problems. And then the second area that he argues that we see this is in the political structure. So we still have extremely low rates of minority representation in our government, especially at the federal level. So you might be sitting here like, well, in Houston, my mayor is a black man. My representative, at least where I live, is a black woman, Sheila Jackson Lee. And so it doesn't maybe feel like that's a problem here, but there's only a handful of racial and ethnic minorities who are in the Senate. We currently have a black vice president, but that's, she's the first one, right? So in general, we have extremely low rates of minority representation in government. And then there are some kind of structural ways that make sure that this happens, right? So we have gerrymandering on the basis of voting. We have annexation in order to create areas that are that have a different composition and kind of make sure that minorities don't get represented in those levels of government. We see a movement towards at-large positions, which are positions where, for example, to get on the city council, you would have to have the entire city vote for you for an at-large position as opposed to your neighborhood, which guarantees in most cities that a minority would have a lower chance of getting one of those positions because you'd have to convince everyone, not just your neighborhood, to vote for you. And where you are a numerical minority, that may be more difficult. And we also see this in electoral participation, right? So we can see this through things like in Texas, voter ID laws, and other ways to make sure that people aren't participating in some ways in a manner that is fairly reminiscent of Jim Crow laws. Another major arena where we see this play out is in social control. And this is probably the area where most people have been paying attention for the last year, right? So with the police killing of George Floyd, a lot of people, became very aware of what is happening in our police system. And obviously it's not just George Floyd, this has been going on for a long time. And we've had these salient examples of this, like Eric Garner and things like that, right? But I think there was something about George Floyd's case and the fact that we could all watch it that really drew a lot of people's attention to this problem. But we see this play out in mass incarceration, where racial and ethnic minorities, particularly Black and Latino men, are far more likely to be incarcerated, and they're far more likely to make contact with the criminal justice system at a bunch of different places, so not just being incarcerated, but in any way you can think of having a contact with the criminal justice system, racial and ethnic minorities are far more likely to have that contact. We see it play out in police brutality and police killings. We see it play out in capital punishment, that racial and ethnic minorities are far more likely to be killed via capital punishment. We see it through the surveillance of Black leaders and Black movements. But the veil, or the way that we see this play out in a more covert fashion, is that the appeal isn't being made to race, it's being made to safety and security, right? And we can all get on board with that, right? That's a good thing, to have safe and secure neighborhoods, even though the way it often plays out is through this somewhat discriminatory process. And then the final arena, major arena, is through racial and economic inequality. So we still have extreme differences by race in terms of both earnings and wealth in the United States. And socioeconomic status is the vehicle to a lot of other opportunities. And so without economic opportunity, it makes it very difficult to advance in this country. But we see huge gaps in wages, we see huge gaps in economic mobility or occupational mobility. We see an enormous gap in wealth. In particular, we see different sort of treatment patterns on the basis of race in terms of managers versus employees. But all of this means that, in a very large way, that the life chances of individuals simply are different in this country. So I have a little graph of that. So this is the wage gap. I don't know how well you probably can't see it, but this is the wage gap by race between groups, and it's rather stark. So all of this essentially amounts to a new racism, a racial order in which we don't talk about race directly, we don't have codes or laws or things like that that make discrimination legal and acceptable. But it has, we eschew direct references to race. We have these covert means of doing this, but what it all culminates in is a system in which some people are able to get ahead much more easily than others, and in which the life chances of members of different racial groups are just radically different from the get-go. And it's on the basis of the color of their skin. And I think we have a growing recognition of this in our society, in both directions, right? So we've seen simultaneously a rise of protest movements to say, hey, we see what's happening here, and we want something different. We want something better. We see that, primarily this year through Black Lives Matter and those movements. And then we also simultaneously see a rise of hate groups, right? So we see a growing recognition on that side in a more overt fashion of what's happening in terms of race in this country. So since the late 90s, we've seen a steady growth in hate groups. And it really took off with the election of Barack Obama. Because his election to the highest land of the office for some folks posed something of an existential threat. And so we see this rise of hate groups. And so we see this pattern where we have these simultaneous movements happening. But I think what it is culminating in is a growing recognition of our race problem as a society. And for as long as we kind of fail to deal with it, we're going to continue to see these things happen. This is my graph of the rise of hate groups over time. So I think, if we want to move past this, I think what you guys are doing are great. We need to talk about it in the open, and talk about race specifically, not about urban people, right? Or use kind of coded language. We need to address it head on. And I think in large part, we need to think about it in a structural way. Because if we continue to think about the problem as an individual level one, and most of us in this room are probably thinking to ourselves, well, I am not a racist, so I'm not contributing to this problem. I don't harbor these feelings. I don't feel hate. I don't use racial epithets and things like that. But if our problem is structural, if it's institutionalized, then we need structural solutions, right? It's not enough for us to go, well, cool, I'm not a racist, so I'm not contributing to the problem. Because we'll never get past it as long as we continue to think about it as whether or not I personally feel hate, right? That we need to think bigger about structural changes that can lead to structural solutions to these problems. So I leave you with that challenge. But that's all I have if we want to do Q&A.
Terrific. Sam, do you want to do some questions?
I haven't had any come in yet.
So how would you respond if someone says, I don't believe in institutional or structural racism? How do you respond to that? If someone says, I don't believe in it, how do you respond?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Because we do seem to have a belief gap in this. Oh, he said, what do you say to people who don't believe in institutional or structural racism? And so me as a social scientist, my response is, well, here, look at all of these statistics that show, right? That if you want to talk about police killings, we have data that shows that if you're a black man in this country, you are far and away disproportionately much more likely to be killed by the police than a white man or a white woman. If you're a white woman, you're basically not going to be killed by the police. And so, there's so much data that we can point to that shows that the life chances of people are so ultimately shaped by these systems. I think we have a broader problem in our society, though, where if you show someone the data, they don't believe it. And I think that's a grander problem, and I'm not totally sure what to do about that one, because we do seem to, and especially over the last year, I think I at least have felt this, that it just seems like more and more we're no longer kind of operating in the same systems. So I mean, I think that question of kind of disbelief, or the idea that this is even a belief system, is hard. And I don't know. But I think we do have, we have so much data that shows that that this is happening, that the life chances of people are fundamentally different. And maybe it's the project of social science to try to do a better job of putting that data out there in a way that real people can, you don't have to take a statistics course to make sense of that data, and you can, readily bring it to people and show them what is happening in a way that, kind of goes, if you can show that something is happening in the aggregate, an average across a population, I think there's some power in that beyond just saying, oh, well, this doesn't jive with my personal experience, or I don't feel like this is true. That if we continue to, bring data that shows, like, this is happening, here's why it's happening, we're doing good work to show this. But, a lot of people don't believe in data or statistics anymore, so that's a whole other problem.
Are there any questions in here? Yeah. Go ahead and come to the microphone.
It's one simple thing. I'm confused when we talk about racism and discrimination. You mentioned that this is the separation of groups. So how we can say you are separating these people and you are racist or you are discriminating? What is the difference between discrimination and racism?
Yeah, that's a good question. So discrimination is an instance of racism, right? So it's a particular action that usually stems from racism, right? So racism is the system of beliefs that one group is superior to other groups. And the way that manifests, the way we see it, is through discrimination. So, but the discrimination is a piece of the puzzle, right? And not all discrimination is racial discrimination, right? You can have discrimination for all kinds of reasons, right? It's basically just picking some aspect of a person, any category that they belong to, and sort of making assumptions about them and denying or affording them opportunities on the basis of that category, which may or may not be racist, right? But if we're doing discrimination on the basis of race, it's a particular instance or an action where we can see racism in play, if that makes sense. But racism is the broader belief system, the broader structure that says the reason why you don't want to give that person a job is because they are inferior, right? So we have the belief structure that says inferior, superior, and then the way that plays out is this person shouldn't live here or shouldn't get this job or something based on that category, based on that group membership.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I have a question.
Hello there. I have a question. Oh, do you have a question?
Go ahead.
Okay. So, as a professor, whatever, and you have a congregation that you could encourage to, what would you say to help us see more of the issue of racism, and what should a faith-based organization try to do to confront it? Do you have any specific ideas or suggestions?
Yeah, so this is a wonderful start, right? Of even just saying, hey, we want to learn more and we want to engage on the topic, I think is a great way to start thinking about, okay, what can we do? But actually the church has been a really powerful force in confronting racism. I mean, the civil rights movement was birthed out of the church. So the church as a fundamentally a community organization has had a lot of power historically on these issues of organizing, of making sense of them, bringing light to the issues. And so I think the faith community has a whole lot to offer on this topic. And while I started my lecture saying that religion was part of the justification for this whole thing, I think religion has also been a powerful force. You know, we see this going back, you know, social gospel. Jane Addams was both sociologist and kind of religious activist who wanted to make change. And I think that the church, having both spiritual authority and, you know, active engagement within the community, and being a space where people meet, I think is a really powerful space, right? That so much of our lives are so segmented, right? That, you know, if you work in a particular industry, you likely know a lot of people who do that thing, which is probably very particular. But you come into a church space and, you know, to the extent that you're being successful at this project, that it can be a really powerful space for making contact with other kinds of people and engaging other kinds of people and other kinds of ideas, right? That, you know, you look across the room right now and there's all kinds of people of ages and walks of life and things like that, and we're all operating in the same space right now. And so I think that the church can be a fairly powerful place where change can take place. And I don't think it's an accident that someone like Martin Luther King Jr. was a minister and operated on that basis. So I think churches have a really powerful place in order to engage the community and, you know, at least in our own kind of smaller ways, you know, try to grapple with these systems, make sense of them, deal with them, contend with them to the extent that we can. I mean, I think sometimes when we talk about structural change, you know, like policing, right? Like, how do you as an individual person, if you're not a police officer or in that system, even begin to think about how you can make structural change to rethink policing altogether in this country is, right? Like, that's a big topic. But I mean, you can do what you can, and I think the power of the church is that there is an organization there, and that it has the ability to kind of insert a voice and make change and create a community in which change is happening. So.
Dr. Freeman, do you, is race problems, especially in, when you look at law enforcement, do you see it more as a problem in an urban area or a rural area? Just my personal experience in a bigger city like Houston is that I haven't experienced as much in a bigger city as I would in an urban area. What do you have to?
That's a good question. So he asked whether or not these racial experiences are distinct if we're talking about an urban area versus a rural area. And he makes the argument that, you know, in Houston, being in a large urban area, that he has not experienced as many sort of negative, you know, has many negative experiences. Yeah, I don't know if the question is so much a rural versus urban split, or at least not as simple as that. So I think there are certain things which manifest themselves more readily in an urban area than they do in a rural area, just because of kind of the scope and the scale of the problem, or the sort of anonymous nature of urban life in a way that you might not see in a rural area. So I think it depends somewhat on what you're talking about. I don't know that there's like a universal answer. And some of that might be that Houston, I think, is a little bit bit different in a lot of ways. Houston is a segregated city, but we're a majority minority city. There's no one group in the city of Houston that has a majority, a 50% majority, which is very unique. And while it is a fairly segregated city, it's segregated in a much more tessellated fashion. So it's more like there's neighborhoods across the city of Houston that tend to have one dominant group or another numerically in that space. But unlike Chicago, for instance, where it is like, this is the white side of the city, this is the black side of the city, and it's this complete split, basically through the middle of the city. And then there's like, here's a little bit of Latino area, right? That it's extremely split on these very clear lines in a way that we don't have in Houston. So I wonder, I think the Houston experience might be kind of different in this regard. I grew up in A-Leaf, and I just ran into all kinds of people from all over the place. My classrooms now at the University of Houston, sometimes I'm just amazed at looking across the classroom, and there's basically every kind of person you can think of in the room. But I don't think that's the modal experience of most Americans. Most Americans operate in very segregated spaces. And I don't want to make it sound like Houston is awesome and we have no problems. Clearly we do. But I think a lot of these experiences are contextual. So I don't know that it's enough to say, oh, this is an urban problem or a rural problem. I think it depends, is my nuanced social scientist answer.
Well, how about we give it All right, let's have a prayer. Gracious God, we are trying to figure out how we can be the instruments of your grace and love in the world. And in a time when it's easy to divide, help us to look for ways to unite. We pray that you would help us to look at things from other people's perspective and work for the reconciliation of the world. We pray all these things in your name. Amen. Thank you for joining us today.